So, of course, we've been talking about China, and that's what the bell ringer was about. What did you learn about China? And then we'll talk about India today, and then we'll finish up by talking about a few places in Africa toward the end of the week. And that's why we had the maps activity about Africa, where you were to go into each of the different sections. And the last one, you just need to go up to the score that you're satisfied with and take a screenshot to submit that. And if you get 100%, you can get 10 bonus points on the next test. So, India, and by the way, the reason why we didn't have a map quiz on China and India, because that would be incredibly easy. I'm sure everyone here can find China and India. So, the notes on India. So let's go ahead and start by talking about India's geography. And of course, there it is. It's very recognizable. The subcontinent that sticks out of the southern end of Asia. If it wasn't such a large, massive land, it would be called a peninsula. So it rests in southern Asia, sticking out into the Indian Ocean. Its land is almost as large as Europe. If you take out the Russian part, it's almost as large as Europe. Living within their borders is almost 1.2 billion people. So almost as big as China. China is 1.3 billion. India is almost 1.2 billion. And like China, they share the Himalayan mountains, which of course is in their northeast quadrant. So northeast. The climate is typically hot, except obviously in the highlands. So once you move up to the Himalayas, for instance, or some of the other higher elevations, obviously, it's not going to be that hot. Most of the greater portion of India has very fertile land, so you can grow crops. But then, of course, especially as you move toward the northwest, it can be a drier climate, with the exception of being around the rivers. And their geographic location, of course, allows them to explore and trade, but on the downside, it also left them open to intervention from countries like Britain. So way out in the open there like that with the ocean at their feet, it gives them great advantages, but also once again allowed them during the imperial era to be, I don't know if you could say they were fully taken over. The Indians certainly felt that way, but they would have a lot of involvement or interference from the British because of their geographic location. And India can trace its roots the whole way back to 1700 BC. 1700 BC. And it has ancient ties to Europe. because invaders did go to India the whole way back then from Europe. In fact, when you look at language groups, the different languages of Europe are often referred to as Indo-European because the two are kind of tied together. So it does have ancient ties to Europe. But like many of the places we talk about, originally it was set up into small kingdoms. And at that period of time, they also set up two distinct cultural traits. One would be Hinduism, which is still common there today. Hinduism. And the other one would be their caste system, which is spelled Caste, their caste system. Now, what that is like is even more rigid than the feudal system because it just doesn't break it up into monarchs and nobles and knights and peasants. It breaks it up into occupation. So every family is set by what type of occupation they had. So your caste might be a caste of carpenters or a caste of doctors, for instance, or some other type of occupational form. And that sounds fine, except you have to realize, of course, then you're kind of locked into the same type of job that your ancestors have done, even if you're not good at it. And secondly, they also discriminated based on the perception of how clean the job was. So if you, for instance, had anything to do with sanitation, refuse, garbage, or anything like that, you were known as one of the lower castes. And you really weren't supposed to socialize with anybody in the upper castes. Now, that kind of thinking exists in all cultures, but theirs was also enforced by law and serious tradition. And that existed for a long time. And even in some more conservative areas of India, they still follow that caste system. So it's a very difficult thing to get away from. Around the time of 1500 BC, India started to develop their system of language. 1500 BC, their system of language. And their system of language is known as Sanskrit, which is spelled Sanskrit. That's Sanskrit. Around 325 BC, they had another round of involvement with Europe. Alexander the Great, who was from north of Greece, actually invaded parts of India, which is a considerable distance away from Greece. So Alexander the Great, and by the way, Alexander the Great did this when he was in his late teens and early 20s, conquered territory as far-reaching as India. But of course, after he died from a disease, he didn't die from warfare or anything, his empire collapsed. After Alexander the Great, India started to see a new type of belief system, Buddhism. Buddhism, which is spelled Buddhism. Buddhism. And Buddhism involves religious tolerance, generosity, wisdom, and kindness. So it involves religious tolerance, generosity, wisdom, and kindness. But Buddhism as a major philosophy or faith will not take hold necessarily in India over the long run. It will actually be exported and become more significant in other places, including Tibet, where it's most well known, but also other places like Japan. Also, around this time, northern India became united and started to trade more with both the West, so over toward Europe, but also toward the East. Starting around the 12th century, they started to see what they refer to as the Mughal Empire, and that's spelled Mughal. This would involve Muslim influence, which still exists there today. Even though Hindus make up the majority of the population, because they have so many people, India actually has one of the largest numbers of Muslims in the world. But as time went by, that empire would weaken. And there would be competition between Britain and France to gain influence over India. And so you started to see British and French colonists arriving, and companies in particular, like the British East India Company. And by 1760, Britain basically had become a ruler of India. Of course, one of the ways they did that was by appointing local leaders to be in charge of a certain area as long as they swore allegiance to Britain. So it seemed like the Indian people were still in charge, but not really. And then there were some specific things that upset the Indian people. One of them was certain Hindu rituals were outlawed. Certain Hindu rituals were outlawed. So Hindu rituals outlawed. The second one should not be a surprise to Americans, but the British levied heavy taxes on the Indians as well. So heavy taxes. And the last item that would upset them was the work of Christian missionaries. Lots of Christian missionaries came to India specifically to convert the Indian people. All right, let's go ahead and pause there for today. Tomorrow we'll talk about how Indians would eventually separate for independence and how their economy changed and grew over time. The last thing for today And of course, you can also work on other stuff from earlier in the unit. But the second journal, you already completed the China and India activity yesterday, but if you want, you can go back and look at that for reference. So what are some major differences between China's and India's growth in just 3 to 5 sentences? So you can work on that, or you can go back and work on the other things. You can work on the map still if you're still going through those. Any of those activities are fine for the remainder of